In the days before online dating, if you wanted to arrange a blind date with a stranger, you had to do it the old-fashioned way. There were newspapers, magazines, and even literal bulletin boards. There were also videotape matchmaking services, as well as pay-per-minute telephone chat lines. Back then, meeting a partner through a dating service was considered somewhat of a novelty. But for many, the novelty was the entire point. It was mysterious, fun, and even a bit dangerous. It also allowed a person to sift through potential mates at a much quicker rate, especially if they were looking for a very specific type of partner, or in the case of one particular New Hampshire woman, a very specific type of victim. Join me now as we examine the utterly bizarre case of Sheila LaBarre, a nymphomaniacal gold digger who left a path of fiery devastation in her wake. You'll learn about a strange series of missing men in rural New Hampshire who had only one thing in common: the woman who'd taken them in. On March 28, 2006, 50-year-old Stephen Martello was driving through New Hampshire when he noticed a woman standing on the shoulder of the freeway. She was dressed in all black from head to toe, waving at cars passing by, clearly looking for a ride. The scene struck him as odd because he didn't see any broken down cars and wondered where'd she come from. Nevertheless, Stephen pulled over and picked her up. Seeing her up close, he could tell they were about the same age, in their late 40s. She was kind of cute, he thought. She introduced herself as Casey and asked if he could give her a ride into Boston. She also had another request. She wanted him to turn the radio off because she said she had a horrible headache. Casey soon filled the silence with conversation, and that's when Stephen began to sense something was a bit off with this woman. As they started driving, she started calling herself Sheila before switching back to Casey, almost as if forgetting who she was supposed to be. She talked about her pet rabbits and told Stephen she was extremely wealthy. At first, he didn't really believe it, until she opened up her purse to pay for gas, and he spotted a massive wad of cash. There had to be thousands of dollars. Again, Stephen couldn't help but wonder what she'd been doing there on the side of the interstate. Soon, Casey, Sheila, or whoever she was, began giving Stephen signals she might be interested in him, touching his leg and giving him a kiss on the cheek. She told Stephen that she liked him and grew increasingly flirtatious, and Stephen didn't seem to mind the direction things seemed to be headed. But when he passed a police car, Stephen noticed Casey ducking down, trying to avoid being seen. This is when he began to wonder if this was really a person he wanted to get romantic with. When they got to Boston, the woman asked Stephen to make a pit stop at a pharmacy, and she went inside. Alone in the car, Stephen seized the opportunity to perform a makeshift background check on the mysterious woman. He called the police, and get this, he asked if any female inmates had escaped from prison, or perhaps if any woman had recently escaped from a mental hospital. The answer to both questions was no, which in Stephen's mind gave him the green light. And if he needed any more encouragement, the woman soon came back to the car with a box of condoms she just purchased. The romantic strangers soon checked themselves into a hotel room where they became intimate almost immediately. And just like the radio, the woman demanded that the hotel TV stay off while they were together. After their intimate moment, Casey started going on and on about her ex-boyfriend and how he was a pedophile, and told Stephen that all pedophiles must die, speaking in grandiose biblical terms, using phrases like, "Vengeance is mine." Continuing on with the biblical theme, Casey went on to tell Stephen that she'd previously died and come back to Earth as an angel. And as if to drive the point home further, told him, "You just had sex with an angel." But most disturbing of all, the woman told Stephen that if he ever told anyone about the romantic encounter, she'd send her pedophile ex-boyfriend after his 9-year-old son. At this point, Stephen had only one thing in mind: getting out of that hotel room as quickly as possible. There was no doubt about it. He thought this woman was crazy. So he made an excuse and left the room, never to see her again. Well, not in person anyways. A few hours later, Stephen was at home watching the evening news, and there on the TV was a photo of the hitchhiker he'd just spent the day with. She was wanted for murder. After Steve drove to the police station and gave a full report of his embarrassing story, the police filled him in on some of the details surrounding their investigation into the woman. Afterward, he just felt lucky to be alive. As it turned out, Steve wasn't the only person who felt that way about the woman. At that very moment, there was another man somewhere in New Hampshire driving a car with a vanity license plate that spelled, "I'm alive," a reference to the exact same woman police were now looking for. 50 miles north of Boston, on a 115-acre farm in the rural town of Epping, New Hampshire, police had already begun what would become the largest homicide search in the history of the state. But investigators weren't just searching for the mysterious woman. They were searching for what she'd done. The LaBarre farm itself was a veritable pastoral paradise. Beautiful rolling hills, green fields, stone fences, and woodlands that highlights New England's colorful symphony of seasons. Nestled at the end of a long dirt road, the farm was home to a herd of horses roaming its pastures. And though there were neighbors, 115 acres offered almost total privacy for whoever lived at that once charming farmhouse. 6 years earlier, the farm belonged to Dr. Bill LaBar, one of the most well-known, loved, and respected men in the town of Epping. The doctor was a World War II veteran and a dedicated chiropractor who, according to town legend, never once missed a day of work in all his years. But it wasn't just his perfect attendance that endeared Dr. LaBar to the town. He had a reputation for only charging patients what they could reasonably afford, something that seems almost incomprehensible today. And then there was his horses, Bill's favorite thing in the world, a joy he loved to share with others. Almost every weekend, Bill could be seen with his horse and carriage around town, happily giving free rides to children. In the town of Epping, Bill LaBar was more than just a pillar of his community. He was an institution. But there was one thing missing from Bill's life: a companion. His first wife had divorced him in the early 1970s, but after just a few years, he met another woman who became the love of his life. Tragically, his second wife passed away from cancer in 1983, an event that truly devastated him. By 1987, Bill was 60 years old and looking for that last piece of the puzzle to cure his loneliness. A woman to share his life, his farm, and his horses with. So Bill decided to place a personal ad in a national dating magazine. Horror movies are a scary good time, but did you know that audio horror storytelling is considered by many to be even scarier than movies? With audio horror, you use your imagination to create the scenes, which makes the horror feel even more immersive. So if you're ready for an experience like that, then brace yourself for the sleepless nightmares of the No Sleep Podcast. This podcast has been one of my favorite shows since I first started listening to podcasts. The No Sleep Podcast is one of the premier horror storytelling podcasts. Now in its 13th year, No Sleep takes audio horror storytelling to a new level. Immersive sound design and custom music scores complement a full cast of voice actors who bring the anthology of creepy tales to life. This weekly, multi-award winning podcast is a perfect way to experience stories which will keep you up at night. The No Sleep Podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. Visit thenosleeppodcast.com to learn more about the show and find hundreds of hours of archived episodes. Soon Bill began receiving letters in the mail in response to the ad. But there was one response that caught his eye in particular. It was from a 27-year-old in Tennessee named Sheila Bailey. And with the letter, she'd sent along an enticing topless photo of herself. He thought she was beautiful and alluring. So Bill took the bait and within months invited the fox straight into the henhouse when he asked her to come and live with him on his farm. By 27, Sheila already had a terrible history with men and bad relationships, beginning with her own father. Born on July 4th, 1958 in northern Alabama, Sheila Bailey was the youngest of 6 children. Her mother worked as a hospital janitor, while her father did roadworks for the state of Alabama. But whenever her father was home, he was known to be a violent, abusive alcoholic. According to Sheila and her older sister Lynn, their father would erupt into drunken rages where he'd practically tear the house apart. Lynn would later recall witnessing her father sexually molesting Sheila on multiple occasions, from the time she was an infant until around the age of 6. And although Sheila was perhaps too young to specifically remember much of the sexual abuse, the themes of pedophilia, incest, and violent abuse would become permanently ingrained in her mind. After high school, Sheila moved out and was married by 23 to a man with a young daughter. But the marriage only lasted just 6 weeks after her husband came home from work to discover something horrific. Sheila had been locking his toddler in the closet while he was away at work, and even threatened to kill the child if she ever told her father. After her divorce, Sheila moved on quickly to another man and another marriage, moving out of Tennessee. But it didn't take long for him to realize Sheila was more than a bit unbalanced. He would later be quoted as saying, "She was just crazy, to put it bluntly." On one occasion, Sheila ended the argument by swallowing a fistful of pills, chugging bourbon, and hopping behind the wheel of his car. This resulted in a severe car crash, leaving Sheila hospitalized and in a coma for 8 days. Afterward, she was placed into a psychiatric ward for another 30. Their marriage ended soon after. So there Sheila was, basically homeless, living out of the local YMCA. She was 27, broke, lonely, frustrated, and unmoored. So she began looking for love in the personal ads of the classified section. And then she saw it. It was a photo of an older gentleman dressed dapperly in a blue suit more appropriate for a church gathering than a night out on the town. It was Dr. Bill LaBar. We'll never know for sure what exactly Sheila was most attracted to. The prospect of stability, his money, or perhaps she thought he seemed vulnerable. Someone she could dominate and control, unlike her previous relationships. Either way, by the spring of 1987, Sheila had Dr. LaBar wrapped around her finger. As soon as Sheila moved in with Bill, she wasted no time announcing herself to the town of Epping with her personality. She was loud, boisterous, and commanded attention. At first, Bill was proud of his beautiful, young new girlfriend, and although they never officially married, Sheila ditched her maiden name and became Sheila LaBarre. But like her other husbands, it wasn't long before Bill began seeing the other side of Sheila, the side that began to dominate, manipulate, and isolate him from his friends and family. Bill's daughter Laura, who was older than Sheila, claimed that after meeting Sheila, her father's entire personality changed. By 1990, Sheila decided she was going to manage Bill's chiropractic business. No longer could residents pay only what they could afford. Sheila made sure they paid full price. After only 3 years in Epping, Sheila became known for her angry outbursts and volcanic temper, with one neighbor even beginning to literally hide in the bushes if he ever saw Sheila walking by. Before long, everyone in the town was avoiding Sheila as much as possible. Everyone, that is, except the men who were interested. According to Sheila, Bill encouraged her to have affairs with younger men, claiming he was aware of his age and wanted her to be happy. So on top of her other well-known attributes, promiscuity soon joined the list. People around town soon began referring to her as Sheila the Peeler, a euphemism for an exotic dancer who peels off their clothes. But there may have been some truth to Sheila's claim that Bill was okay with the affairs, because in 1995, Sheila officially married a Jamaican national named Wayne Ennis, and together they both lived at the farm in the same house with Bill. And while it's possible this arrangement demonstrates Bill's open-mindedness, as Sheila would claim, was it also possible that this was more indicative of the type of control and subjugation Sheila was exerting over Bill by this time? Between Wayne and Sheila, heated arguments and physical fights were common enough that police had to intervene on a number of occasions, and by 1996, Wayne and Sheila were divorced. But it didn't take long for Sheila to move to another man, James Brackett. And from there, Sheila's already violent temper only increased. The next few years between her and James were a constant barrage of violent altercations, with Sheila even being arrested for stabbing James in the face with a pair of scissors. According to James, Sheila would fire her handgun at him, threaten to kill him, and physically abuse him. On one occasion, she hit him so hard in the mouth with a barbecue tool, he lost his 2 front teeth. But it wasn't just physical violence Sheila used as a weapon. There was also psychological warfare going on as well. Sheila began constantly accusing James of abusing the farm animals, which wasn't true, not at all. But after a while, James claims he started to believe it himself. It was clear to him that Sheila believed her own lies. And then she started accusing him of being a pedophile. Again, nothing could be farther from the truth, but it was obvious that Sheila needed him to confess to things he'd never done. But still, unbelievably, James stuck around, demonstrating the mysterious hold Sheila maintained over the men in her life. By December 2000, Bill LaBar was 74 years old when his health went suddenly downhill, with witnesses recalling his complexion taking on an unsettling shade of green. On December 2nd, he passed away. The official cause given by the coroner was massive heart attack, hypertension, and arteriosclerosis. After Bill's passing, Sheila inherited the entire $2 million estate. Questions quickly arose about the possibility of foul play in regards to both Bill's will and his death itself. But questions and speculation were all they would ever really come to. And just like that, Sheila became one of Epping's wealthiest residents. In later years, an expert psychiatrist who examined Sheila would claim this was a watershed moment in her psyche. He claimed that despite the way she treated Bill, he'd been an anchor tethering her to reality. The father figure she'd never had, yet desperately needed. His theory was, after Bill's death, Sheila became more and more detached from the real world and more consumed by her unresolved childhood trauma. She began projecting the themes of pedophilia, incest, and sexual violence onto anyone around her, and developed a pathological desire to dominate and control men, both sexually and psychologically. James Brackett, who was still with Sheila at the time, was probably the first person to notice the change, when she began insisting he was secretly a pedophile. This lasted for 2 years until James finally decided it was time to escape by hitchhiking to a homeless shelter in a nearby town. He felt lucky to be alive. In fact, James is the man who would eventually drive around New Hampshire with a vanity plate reading, "I'm alive," because he knew just how close he'd come. Ironically, the homeless shelter James fled to is exactly where Sheila met her next victim. A move that seems calculated to find an extremely vulnerable man she believed she could completely manipulate. Michael DeLawes was a 35-year-old drifter from Connecticut. He'd been married, divorced, and was now down on his luck when Sheila offered him a job at her horse farm. Because Michael had an intellectual disability, he didn't have many opportunities for employment. Before long, Michael and Sheila's relationship progressed beyond the professional. By 2004, Michael was already telling his family about the wonderful woman he'd met. They were elated, happy to believe that Michael was getting the attention, care, and love they knew he needed. But they didn't know what was really going on behind closed doors, and it was very likely Michael didn't fully understand it either. A few months later, Sheila rang up Michael's mother, screaming and yelling that Michael was a child molester, a pedophile, and that he'd molested his own siblings. In the background, his mother could hear Michael confessing to the horrible acts, but his speech was slurred. Something was definitely not right. His parents knew none of this was true, and his siblings, the alleged victims, denied any of it ever happened. But it wasn't just Michael's family that was noticing a problem. One winter day, Sheila's neighbor, the one who hid in the bushes to avoid her, saw Michael walking slowly down the road. He was beaten, scratched, bloody, and bruised. When the neighbor asked him what had happened, Michael simply replied, "It's Sheila." Michael then walked more than 20 miles on his own back to the homeless shelter. But soon, Sheila showed up and brought him back to the farm, where she set up an audio recorder to tape her own interrogation of Michael. The recording appears nothing short of psychological torture. On tape, Sheila can be heard demanding Michael to admit to raping a young family member, bestiality with her pet rabbits, arson, being a pedophile, and being sexually attracted to his own mother. To every question she asked, Michael weakly responded, "Yes." Not long after making the recording, in the fall of 2005, Sheila officially informed authorities that Michael was no longer living at her address. Nobody ever saw Michael DeLawes again. That winter, Sheila began using a telephone sex chat hotline called Telemates. She'd spend hours talking to various men, often encouraging them to talk dirty, and almost always steering the conversation towards incestuous fantasies. In February 2006, she began chatting with a 24-year-old, Kenny County, who agreed to go on a date with her. After meeting at a fancy restaurant on Valentine's Day, Sheila ended the date by becoming intimate with Kenny in the back of her Cadillac. Like Michael, Kenny also had a disability, reportedly with the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Throughout Kenny's childhood in Massachusetts, he excelled in athletics, especially hockey. His father coached him, and he'd grown up to be a pleasant, good-natured man. After graduating high school, Kenny decided to join the U.S. Army, something that had been a dream and passion of his. But he wasn't able to pass basic training. After his failed stint in the Army, Kenny did his best to live independently from his mother. He got a job at a car wash and moved into an apartment, but still, Kenny was lonely. So just 4 days after meeting Sheila on their first date, Kenny agreed to move in with her. He didn't even pack a bag before leaving home and moving to the farm. Kenny's mother, Carolyn, was extremely concerned about the rash decision, and just 2 days after he'd moved out, called Sheila's number, hoping to talk to Kenny. Instead, the conversation ended with Sheila hanging up, telling Carolyn to leave Kenny alone. Later that week, Carolyn filed a missing persons report with Epping police. By this point in time, Epping police were already all too familiar with Sheila. They even had a policy that no officer would ever go to Sheila's property alone. They always went in twos. When officers went over to Sheila's to perform a welfare check on Kenny, they arrived to find him apparently happy and healthy. He looked normal, uninjured, and in good spirits. Satisfied that Kenny was certainly not a missing person, the officers left. That was February 24th, 2006. 2 weeks later, Kenny wasn't looking so good when a strange scene occurred at a local Walmart. The incident started when Sheila began ranting and raving to store employees that someone had attacked Kenny in the store, an event that almost certainly never actually happened. The employees noted that Kenny looked like he'd been in a terrible accident. His face had cuts all over it, and he had several burns on his arms and torso. One employee noted that Kenny's skin appeared to have a weird greenish color. During the entire encounter, Kenny never made eye contact with a single person. A week later, Sheila and Kenny were back at the store again. This time, Sheila pushing Kenny in a wheelchair shopping cart. He looked even worse than before. More cuts, worse skin, and now, apparently, immobile as well. Again, Sheila made a scene, and this time the police were called. When officers showed up, they were startled by how much Kenny had deteriorated since they'd last seen him. They asked him if he was all right, but Kenny didn't respond. Believing they didn't have any legal ability to intervene on Kenny's behalf, police watched Sheila and Kenny leave the store with their purchase, 2 large diesel-fueled jugs. The next week, Sheila called the police sergeant herself to say that Kenny was no longer living at the farm. She didn't know where he'd gone, but thought he may have moved back to Massachusetts. The sergeant relayed this information to his mother, and immediately she filed another missing persons report. The following day, the sergeant received a strange and disturbing call. It was from Sheila. On the phone, she played an audio tape she'd recorded of Kenny. She was interrogating him, accusing him of raping young children. And hauntingly, Kenny weakly answered yes to all of her accusations. There's a reason this may sound familiar, because it was basically a repeat of what had happened to Michael DeLoss, the other love interest of Sheila's that mysteriously vanished. Toward the end of the tape recording, the sergeant could hear what sounded like Kenny vomiting, and then what sounded like him passing out. It's not entirely clear what Sheila was hoping to accomplish with the phone call, but all it did do was send police right back to her farm. When police arrived at Sheila's farm, it was dark and no one was home. But as they approached the house, they could see a couple burnout fire pits on the front lawn. Looking at the ashes in one of the pits, they were disturbed to find a bone, possibly human. But they couldn't help but wonder if it belonged to Kenny. And then Sheila came home. When police asked her about the bones in the fire pit, her answer was something they'd never forget. She told them that the bone was either from a rabbit or a pedophile. But as soon as the words came out of her mouth, she began denying she'd ever said it and asked police to leave her property. By 9 the next morning, police showed up in full force, and this time with a search warrant. Completely covered in soot, it was obvious Sheila had been doing more burning throughout the night as she tried to hide inside her home. But the bone police had seen the night before was now missing. More than ever, they were convinced something truly terrible had happened at that farm. When they asked Sheila where Kenny was, she pointed at a Walmart bag sitting next to one of the fires. It was full of ash, She then said, "He's in there." Police took Sheila down to the station for an official interview, where most of her ramblings were completely incoherent. She did adamantly deny playing any part in Kenny's disappearance, or as police already suspected, his murder. But without any solid evidence to charge her, eventually they had to let Sheila go. Their only requirement was that she stay away from the farm until they finished their search. Investigators tasked with searching Sheila's property were shocked by what they saw. What was once a beautiful horse farm was now nothing short of a rundown dump. It was obvious that the maintenance had been severely neglected since Dr. LaBar passed away. In the back of Sheila's truck were the yellow diesel fuel jugs she bought with Kenny at Walmart. They were empty and smelled like fuel. But it was looking inside the house that sent chills down their spines. First, it became apparent that Sheila just didn't have a few pet rabbits. Her house was practically infested with them. Then they noticed the smell of vomit lingering throughout the house. Upon closer inspection, detectives began noticing some tiny brownish stains on the walls and on the cabinetry. They tested positive for blood. And once they began noticing the stains, they started seeing them everywhere. They began to realize the entire house had become the scene of a gruesome bloodbath. Even more disturbing, a few days into the search, detectives noticed that many of the bloodstains were a different shade, a different age. Whatever had happened inside this home had happened more than once, and an arrest warrant for Sheila was quickly issued. As investigators searched the farm, Sheila slipped out of town after taking out $87,000 from her bank account. She was officially now on the run. And that's when 50-year-old Stephen Martello picked her up hitchhiking along the side of the interstate. But Stephen wasn't the only man who took her in. The day after Stephen informed police about his encounter with Sheila, she'd already found another man. She'd met him in a parking lot of a wholesale store. After approaching him and chatting for a few minutes, he invited her to hop in his vehicle. For the next 3 nights, they stayed in various hotel rooms together. They were planning to spend more time together, but the man happened to visit his cousin's house one day, and that's when he saw Sheila's picture on the news. Immediately, he called police and told them where they could find her. She was arrested without incident on April 2nd, 2006. By the time Sheila was arrested, investigators had discovered a multitude of partially cremated bone fragments, ribs, arms, feet, skull, and teeth. A number of them were found in the Walmart bag and confirmed to be human. There was little doubt these were the remains of Kenny County. The big question mark for authorities was whether or not Sheila's farm held evidence of more murders. In an attempt to find more evidence, nearly 200 policemen were called to the farm to scour every inch of the 150-acre property. The forensic search inside the farmhouse was equally as thorough, with hundreds of bloodstains recorded and documented, and a bloody knife discovered. Even Sheila's septic system was drained and checked for evidence, twice. Inside they discovered more bone fragments, cell phone fragments, a bullet casing, and most disturbingly, a birth certificate belonging to a man they hadn't yet realized they were looking for. The certificate belonged to Michael DeLaws. DNA tests on some of the bloodstains would eventually confirm they'd come from Michael as well. In February 2008, nearly 2 years after her arrest, Sheila entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, openly admitting to have murdered both victims. Sheila has since given varying accounts of how each man had been murdered, but none of her stories match the horrific forensic evidence found inside her home. It's likely that Sheila has never given the full truth. However, Because she legally admitted to the murders at trial, the only item the jury needed to consider was whether or not Sheila was insane at the time the murders took place, regardless of how they took place.
This means that at trial, you and your lawyers will have to prove that at the time of the murders, you were legally insane and therefore not criminally responsible for your actions. Do you understand that?
Amazingly, there is no strict legal definition of insanity, which opens the door to a wide range of interpretations. However, once the trial begins, the only interpretation that matters is the opinion of 12 jurors. The defense and prosecution both put forward expert psychiatrists to examine Sheila. The defense expert diagnosed Sheila with schizoaffective disorder and a delusional disorder. In his opinion, he considered Sheila psychotic now and then, meaning her thinking was detached from reality. He described Sheila's progression to insanity by saying that her childhood trauma from sexual abuse progressed into a personality disorder. The disorder eventually festered into clinical psychosis, and this psychosis had given way to what he called fixed delusion, a permanent detachment from reality. The defense argument boiled down to this: Sheila truly believed the horrible accusations she'd levied against both Michael and Kenny, and believed it was her duty to punish them. Her attorneys claimed that Sheila believed she was an avenging angel sent by God to rid the world of pedophiles. The psychiatrist told the jurors that Sheila was the most profoundly disturbed patient he'd ever examined. Needless to say, the prosecution's expert psychiatrist didn't agree. In his diagnosis, Sheila wasn't schizophrenic. Instead, he believed Sheila suffered from a personality disorder with borderline and antisocial features, and that she also exhibited a sexual disorder called paraphilia, in which Sheila was aroused by atypical sexual fantasies and behaviors. In his opinion, he didn't believe Sheila's motive for murder had been to rid the world of pedophiles. Instead, he believed she was aroused by them. This explains why Sheila had chosen the victims she did. They were disabled, vulnerable, easily manipulated men. She selected victims who she'd be able to brainwash into going along with her utterly disturbed paraphilic fantasies. The jurors were left with only two options. Either Sheila was completely insane, or a sadistic psychopath who knowingly manipulated, tortured, and murdered victims for her own twisted pleasure. At the end of closing arguments, the jury went to deliberations. 13 hours later, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty. Sheila was officially declared sane. As they left the courtroom, the jurors received a standing ovation from the gallery. Astonishingly, as soon as the verdict was read, Sheila immediately embraced her attorney with utter relief. "Thank God they know I'm sane," she said. In the attorney's opinion, there could be no better proof that she was anything but, and Sheila was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the years since Sheila's conviction, there are still many lingering questions surrounding the case. But the biggest question is whether or not Sheila LaBarre was a serial killer. During investigators' extensive search of her property, police also discovered the remains of a set of human toes. DNA confirms they didn't belong to either Kenny or Michael. The death of Bill LaBar has also again been called into question. Unfortunately, Sheila made sure his body was cremated just days after his death. Both Kenny and Michael's mothers sat through the entire trial, leaving the room on occasion when specific testimony was too difficult to hear. After the verdict, they gave each other a hug, and Michael's mother told Carolyn, "We got it." It's believed Sheila had chosen her victims because she believed they were men no one would miss or even notice had disappeared. But in that regard, she'd severely miscalculated. Both men were deeply loved and are now desperately missed by their families. During sentencing, Carolyn was given a chance to give her truly heartbreaking statement.
When I held my precious baby Kenny in my arms not so many years ago, I could never have imagined the cruelty and evil that my son would encounter in his short life. I tried to equip Kenny with the skills necessary to deal with the cruelties in life, but he never grasped them. He had a heart of gold. He always saw the best in people. When he met Sheila LaBarre, he believed her when she said she wanted to be with him. In Kenny's mind, he was going to live a new life on the farm, a new beginning. Sheila LaBarre took advantage of my son, who was kind, caring, gentle young man who could not socially defend himself. She was a master of evil who deliberately tortured him. Sheila LaBarre stripped my son of all his dignity and self-worth, and in the end, she murdered him. My life has changed forever, and stare at the door hoping for Kenny to walk through with his big, beautiful smile that would light up my heart. And when the telephone rings, I hold my breath, hoping to hear his voice once again. I cannot sleep. I dare not sleep. For when my eyes close, I see my son's terrified eyes pleading for me to save him. I hear his voice echo through my soul. Ma, help me. Oh, Kenny, my love, I did everything in my power to save you. You were at my fingertips, and I could not reach you. Kenny, I was so close. I am so sorry.